Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to, finally, CarMiZa Trunk Details Part 8. Today is Monday, September 4th. Happy Labor Day to everyone. Just wanted to provide a quick update. I took August effectively off. I have one of my cars, my E55, as you can see, the front bumper's off. Somebody hit me, so I'm dealing with that. We also have, you can see out there, a horse trailer that I had to get cleaned up and ready to sell. We're downsizing our horse setup, and we picked up a newer Ram for my wife. So I've been super busy with all that stuff, and unfortunately I have not basically touched the BMW in about a month. So I'm kind of chomping at the bit, and I'm ready to get back into it. Also wanted to provide a quick update on the zebra wood. I know if you've been following along, I was really stressed about the twisted wood and the issues we were having with the zebra wood. Happy to report my father has the wood and making really good progress. He was able to rough cut. He's working on it slowly, just taking his time, but he was able to rough cut the 4 pieces needed, again, to basically, the kind of the 4 quadrants that'll be the floor. He was able to plane them. He built a jig setup, and he was able to plane them to 11/16, so just a 1/16 of an inch shy of 3/4, which will be fine. And everything's coming out really good. He's working on kind of lining up the book match pattern to be able to get the final cut using a flush trim bit, and then he'll work on starting to drill the holes. So making really good progress there, and I think we're over the scare of whether or not that was going to be an expensive bonfire. Also, at this point, as you know, if you've been following along, I still have a ton of little details to do on the items in the floor. The millbirds need a bunch of work. I've got to, braze up these brackets. There's just a whole bunch of loose things to do. And one of the biggest things is the gold plating. And if anybody that's watching this knows anybody who can do 24 karat gold plating dipping, I'd rather do dipping than brush on. That can accommodate something, this big. These are 18 by 5 by 7 inches. I'm willing to pay the price, but I am having a heck of a time. I was only able to I checked with about 30 companies, and I found 2 companies that are willing to do it and are able to do it. And I got quotes of between $5,000 and $6,000, which is more than I want to spend. I'm hoping to be able to get away for quite a bit less. I think they were just giving me a go away kind of a price. I don't think that's, even with, I should need a little less than an ounce of gold, I think, to do everything, and it's $2,000 an ounce. So, maybe whatever. It shouldn't be 5,000 to 6,000 in my opinion. So, all right. So the purpose of this video is I'm going to start working on what's going to happen up here. If you recall, here's kind of my inspiration picture. This is the way Earl had the car originally. Hopefully that's not out of focus. And you can see the items hanging off the rear deck. So it's basically 2 Sony changers here and here, and in the middle were the X1 and P1 main hideaway packs. Many people didn't know this. Up above the Sony equipment was a pair of Zapco amplifiers. So, and they were smaller amps than what I have in the car now. These are the amplifiers out of the car when I purchased the car. These are 2 Z600s. And when Earl had the other setup, like I just showed you in the picture, he had a Z300 and then a Z50 that he was using for rear fill, just because Ayaska told him he needed rear fill. So at no point did the car have these 2 side by side on the rear deck, underneath the rear deck. They were hanging together. If you recall, one below the other. That's the way the car was when I bought it, and it had the Z50 changer next to it. So what I want to do, again, is I'm going back to this original look, but I want to use the 2 Z600s. Also, as far as we could tell, Earl and I were talking about it the other day, from his memory, he recalls that he did the Z600s at the same time he did the 15s. In the floor, the Nautilus 15s. So the Z600s are much more power, And if, you know, they were never on the 13s. So the 13s should sound a lot better than they did because it's a little bit more than double the power and a little bit better amp, I think. You know, more power is better, obviously. So at this point, what I'm doing is taking the amps apart, kind of assessing what's going on. I'm going to replace all the caps. I am, as you guys know by now, a little crazy. So even those Allen heads that are holding in the rails for the transistors, there's a little rusty. There's an odd one there. It's scary a little bit. I'm going to replace all of those bolts with stainless, just again to do everything as good as I can. These amplifiers were originally white. They were painted like this silvery gray, and it's gotten a little bit beat up. So I'm going to be stripping and repainting the amplifiers. They're going to be the same color as the Sony components. Well, I should say the C1 changers, because the P1 and X1 are going to be gold plated. So that is where I am at. And also, if you recall, down underneath here, you can see I had those foam pieces that I used to kind of mock up the trunk. One of the biggest things, or a couple of the big things with regard to the components hanging off the trunk, is the spacing. So this is where the RCAs go, right here for the Milberts. And because of the vertical height, you know, all the components, it's a really tight fit. I've got about a 1/4 of an inch of play. So I had to be really, really careful. And I may end up having to modify the brackets. As you can see, this is the bracket that holds the Zapcos, which elevates it. And then it's got this cooling fan at the bottom and an intake here. Sneak peek here, I think I'm going to utilize a liquid cooling system for a PC. I'm looking into those devices. They run on 12 volt DC. Looking into it. Not sure I'm going to do that 100%, or I may do a different kind of a cooling setup, something kind of unique. But I need to be able to mount the amplifiers as tightly to the rear deck as possible, which will give me more space for, again, the RCAs. I also, when the amplifiers are on the rear deck, I've got to come up with a way to mount the Sony components. So I may, and for some of you Zapco purists, this might hurt you a little bit, I may mill into the amplifier and either thread the amplifier, or as you can see, there's enough room in there, I might be able to get an insert into there. We'll see. That's effectively what I'm kind of planning. Right now is the hardest part of this type of a build, is trying to figure out all the logistics, the planning. The execution isn't that, you know, typically that difficult. It's kind of engineering and figuring everything out so that you don't pigeonhole yourself. And in this case, again, there's kind of a lot going on. The same was true, again, if you recall, if you've been watching along, all the time and planning and, you know, cardboard mock-ups and all that stuff to build the floor. But I think the floor came out really, really good. You know, and again, you can see it's just sitting in there now, but like the degree of precision, you know, that everything lines up, all the stuff my father and I are doing with the zebra wood, it should be really, really good. So stay tuned. We'll have some more going on here, hopefully soon. Thanks for watching. Talk to you in a little bit. All right, at this point I am still very, very much kind of planning everything out, and I've got some cool ideas that I've come up with so far. So these are obviously the heat sinks for the Z600 Zapcos. Fully disassembled these. I'm going to strip these, repaint them. I've got a guy, I'll hold off on mentioning his name until he's okay with it. There's somebody on Facebook who I posted about whether or not there are links. Some amplifier companies will, you know, take one of their chassis and cut it up into pieces and sell links where you can do like a spacer and also do like an end cap to hide the wiring. So I don't think they make them for this series of Zapco amps, but someone had the same idea that I did, and they took one of these chassis and they cut it into 4 equal pieces. And he hasn't done anything with it in 28 years. So hopefully he comes through and he's willing to sell those. And then I'm going to do a spacer. I kind of measured everything out. I'll do a 2-inch spacer here and then 2-inch caps on the end. The amplifiers are 18 inches. So what'll that give me? 42 inches overall length. So it'll kind of look like one giant amp. And again, the Zapco, It's going to be hanging off the rear deck there, and I'm going to paint it the same color as the C1s. The C1s are going to stay this silver. These C1s, I have like 6 of these changers. These are not in great shape. You can see the big scratch here. I have a pair that are pristine, if you remember, brand new in the box, never used. I did have to replace the DC to DC converters on them, but they are like brand new. So when everything is done and I'm ready to do the final assembly, I will use those changers. Until then, I'm going to use these as a mock-up. I'm also going to see if I can gut the changers so that I'm just dealing with the shells, which would be a lot easier to move around and kind of figure out my mounting. I do have, Sony had these mounting plates that you could use to basically, you know, do these brackets. I won't use these brackets. I'm going to come up with my own design there. And I have a P1 and an X1 that I'll be using for mock-up. Same thing, I'm going to see if I should be able to gut these and just use the chassis. These two are spares. And if you recall, these items are going to be gold-plated, sanded down, and then gold-plated. So I'm not too terribly worried about these. And I have 4 each of these. So I have several spares to work with. So that's it for this point. I'm going to continue working on kind of mapping everything out. And there's a lot of planning going into this, and I'll have an update here shortly. All right, here I am kind of harvesting the guts out of the C1 changers. Obviously, that's where the majority of the weight is. So I need to pull these absorption devices off. That's effectively what holds it, because the whole thing, the whole chassis basically floats, as you can see there. And then this is aluminum and plastic, so it's quite light. So by the time I get it all apart, that'll be a lot more manageable and easier to work with. Changer number 1, gut extraction successful. Nothing in there, as you can see. Nice and light. Now it's just the chassis. It's everything I need to be able to get everything mocked up and laid out. It's much, much lighter. And there are the pieces parts. If anyone is interested, if you do have a C1 and it's giving you issues, 99% of the time, it's separate of skipping and all of that. If it doesn't have any output or it doesn't load or do anything like that, this is probably the culprit. Very difficult to get these, but reach out to me and I might be able to help you out. This circuit board is located on this back panel. It's real easy to take off. There's 6 screws and that comes out. And then there's a few different things that plug into it. Doing the converter also is a little bit tricky. But again, if someone's interested in doing that, I could help you and walk you through it. I've done a bunch of them. Also, if you are taking apart one of these changers, there are these screws on the side. Sony does a really good job of giving you arrows to indicate disassembly screws. That basically is an indication that if you want to take it apart, pull these screws out. If you notice, there are these holes that do not have that arrow. That's because these go into here. That's where those screws came from. If you try to remove these screws, you have to do it with the cover off, and you need to kind of hold on to this, because otherwise this will just spin and you'll end up ripping this. Which these, I'm going to see if I can try to source new ones. These are, I think they're like oil filled or whatever. I don't know what their life expectancy is, but unlikely it's 30 or more years. So we'll see what happens there. I did test my 2 good changers. The final changers I'll be using, and kind of, you know, hit them when they were playing and everything. I played them for 20 hours probably for the pair. And no skipping whatsoever. So, yep, that's what the inside of a C1 looks like. Don't make them like they used to. Pretty solid copper isolation there. Really well built. Kind of slow and clunky as far as the mechanism goes, but amazing sound quality. So, all right, so that's one changer done. I'll get the other changer complete. Look at that, it's nice and light. And then I'll move on to the P1 and X1 brains, and hopefully I get lucky. Bugs all over the place. And I can do the same thing and have some nice light components to be able to mock up with. Real quick, here's something cool. Well, not cool, but I wanted to show people in case they're like, what is that? These two changers don't work great, and I think it's the DC to DC converter. But what also goes is especially these 2 capacitors right here on these C1s. It's kind of
not focusing. See where it sort of looks like flux almost from solder? That's actually the guts of the capacitor, the liquid of the capacitor. You can see it leaking out there. And if it gets really bad, it'll kind of mess up the traces on the board. I've had to replace these. I got I don't know, 20 of these caps or whatever just to have them handy. But this is really common on the C1s as well. So if you have an issue and it's not the DC to DC converter, it very well could be these caps. I've seen one of my changers, it was like liquid all inside of here. So I don't even know how it held that much liquid, but it did. So again, another cool thing to be aware of if you're playing with these C1 changers. All right, up next is I've had these apart before, and I'm pretty sure I can do what I want to do is attempt to basically take the guts out of the P1 and X1. So let's give it a shot. All right, here's the X1 or P1 with the cover off. Again, kind of old school technology, but for me, it's the best way. They don't make them like they used to. I'll continue with the dismantling of this piece. Another successful extraction. There again is the, this is I think it's a control board. And then the main board for the P1. Once again, DC to DC converter, Sony, XES stuff. These are always the culprit. As you can see, this one's fine. On the P1s, if anyone's interested, these are relatively rare to go bad on the brain, but on the display, they almost always go bad. And that, when that goes bad on the display, you don't have a display. It's dark. You'll still have output, but the display doesn't work. So it's, again, a common culprit there. A new DC to DC converter, and the thing is back in business. Once again, this is, I don't know, I saved probably half the weight, a pound or two. But again, it's going to be a lot easier to do all the fit up that I'm about to do. On to the X1. Okay, so got everything extracted, I'll call it. So I got my Zapco chassis. Once again, I'm going to be making my own bottoms. You'll see why for the amplifiers. I'm going to modify some things and do some things with that. So I will be making my own bottoms. And then, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm hoping to get spacer links to be able to kind of hide the wiring and also the center area. I got my X1 and P1s all hollowed out. My two C1 changers hollowed out as well, and saved some weight, made it easier to kind of lay it all out. So those are really the 6 items that are going to be hanging off the rear deck. And I've got to build some I'm going to over-engineer, as I normally do, some pretty elaborate brackets and aluminum panels and all kinds of stuff to hold it. For anyone that's interested in seeing what all that stuff looks like naked, here you go. So again, those are the two C1 changers, internals. This is the P1 with the second board. I'm going to be recapping all of this, which should be good, fun, because I don't trust them. If anybody knows, if you want to put it in the comments below, I've been looking for a meter to be able to test capacitors in circuit, and I've read a lot of varying things about that doesn't work or whatever, and you're just better off to pull the caps and then measure them. But as you can see on the X1, I got a lot of caps here. So there's a ton of electrolytics on here, and these things are 25, almost 30 years old. So I don't trust any one of them. There's nothing that's leaking or bulging. But again, I'm sure their values are off, which is going to skew things and really potentially make a big mess. But once again, check out like 8 different dedicated discrete Burr Brown. These are Burr Brown 20-bit DACs in here instead of just having one DAC for the entire unit. This is kind of an old school topography, but I tend to like this kind of stuff. And you can see everything in the back side of the boards. There's a lot going on. Obviously nowadays you can fit this in a much smaller, compact kind of a circuit. But I prefer the old school stuff. I prefer the sound. To me, it's way more analog and natural sounding than any of the new stuff. Earl and I listened to some of the new stuff and just didn't do it. So, all right, that's going to be it for this part. We'll continue on. I'll continue on this video. We'll have some more content, but that gets me into the next part where I'm going to be moving to the next stage. Okay, I'm cruising along in the design phase. One of the things I'm trying to do going forward is with these videos to show you stuff and not to talk too much about what I plan on doing. But I just want to cover some brief things here. If you notice, these are the right angle straight wire RCA jacks. I put the sockets into the Milberts. And this is basically the highest point on the Milberts. So that's going to be my issue to fit everything into the trunk. And it is a very tight fit. Here's basically what I'm working on. I took this piece of plywood, kind of laid out where I'm going to be putting the amps. So a couple things I'm doing here. Number one, I wanted the gains, which are on this end, to be, both of them to be at the far end, right? So to do that, I basically had to take one amp and turn it around. But in doing so, it's tough to see right now, but basically the grooves, or the fins, if you will, in the amplifier, you can see it better there, here are asymmetrical. It's different, right? But this center pin right here, there's basically a bolt that goes in here, 2 screws, and they come through and hold this device here, okay? So I determined that this was in the center. I basically, and as you can see, both these boards are just sitting in here. So I flipped one chassis around, but I put the board back in the opposite way. And in doing so, if you notice on this one, let's remove this plexi, you can see where the screws are lined, where they're going to line up properly for the rails for the transistors. But on this amp, that's not the case, because again, I effectively spun the board around. So I've got a machinist who will go through and re-drill and tap the amplifier so that I could fit the rails correctly. This is all just to make sure that this, which you won't see, will line up on the 2 amplifiers. So if I slide both of these back, you can see this is a deeper groove. And I'll explain something on this in just a minute. All right. The reason I'm doing this is that while these fins look like they're symmetrical on both sides of the amp, I don't want to take anything for granted. So the bottom line is I'm going to have the fins, or the chassis, line up, and hopefully the fins align as good as possible. If you notice here, this is a 2-inch gap, and there is a gentleman that's been super helpful. His name is James McDonald. Shout out to James. He was nice enough to get in contact with me after I posted on a Car Audio Facebook page. And he basically, Zapco doesn't make spacers for these amps. I don't think they ever did. But he had the same idea that I did, where I wanted to do like spacers. So he took an old Z600, one of these amps, and sliced up the chassis. And he is shipping those out to me. I purchased those from him. Thanks again, James. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to have those milled. They're a little bit bigger than I need. So I'm going to go 2 inches here. I'll go 2 inches on the end with a cap on the end of it, and then 2 inches on the end here. So again, if you notice, my gains will be at opposite ends. Those will be somewhat accessible in the trunk, likely without any tools. I don't really, normally I leave the gains all the way down, and I'll be running a lot of voltage, signal voltage, probably at least 10 volts RMS into the amplifier. So I normally leave the gains all the way down, but I may want to crack them just to bias the input. So, all right, so that is basically that part. The next thing I'm working on is the placement of the P1 and X1. So imagine this is the rear deck, right? There's a piece of aluminum that's going to hang from the rear deck, the big plate of aluminum that I'm going to be working on. So imagine that is this piece. The amps are then mounted here. Now I needed to figure out a way to mount the amplifiers through the rear deck, and I couldn't really, I wanted effectively a stud, right, that would go into here. So what I'm going to be using is, let me pull it out. These are made for kayak rails, and I found these. They're stainless steel. They're 1/4 So what I'm going to do, again, if you notice, there is a kind of an indent right here that's deeper. It's 1/8 of an inch deeper. These are going to go here, and I'm going to drill the holes. I'll set up a fence on my drill press, but they're going to go like this. And they're going to go through the chassis of the amp. And if you notice, these will line up nicely right here. That's going to effectively give me a stud, and then that will go through the rear deck. So more on that later, and kind of how I'm going to do those. Again, I spent the last 24 hours that I've been working on the car, working on kind of the mock-up, the design, and all of that. I spend a lot of time doing this stuff so that the execution is easier and I don't pigeonhole myself and end up with a big problem. Despite all my planning, as complex as this is, it's really tough not to run into snags or things that I don't, consider. So to that point, the next thing I'm doing here is I took thin plexiglass, much like you saw I did on the zebra wood, and I cut those the length of the amplifier, and basically these sit in where the amp covers would be. I'm going to make new covers for the amplifiers, okay? This represents, this little circle here, represents, as you can see here, where the factory fan was, and then there was kind of exhaust ports there. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out, can I put the fans here still or not? And the other big thing I need to figure out is, if we look at the P1 and X1, these are the next things I'm going to work on. Again, those are gutted, so I just have these empty chassis. I need to figure out how I'm going to get this mounted on here. And my objective is that you do not see any hardware. And then there will be a C1 hanging off this side and another C1 hanging off here. Again, I've got most of this figured out. And I'll show you that as I go, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of what's going on here so far. All right, be with you shortly. All right, I mentioned earlier, kind of touched on possible PC style cooling, and I'm going, believe it or not, a little crazy. So here's what I'm doing. This again, I really am apprehensive to show you all the planning stuff. I'd rather just show you progress, but there is so much planning that's going into this part. Everything is kind of integral, right? So a lot of design, and I'm over 30 hours at this point so far this month, and I haven't picked up a tool other than measuring tapes. So here's what I'm doing. Currently, the way the Milberts work, these are the barrier strips. There is one for each speaker group, and then there's the power. The way that the wires work is they go into the amplifier like this. This again is the back of where the wiring is going to come up. You can see my holes, right? So I'd have to, the wiring for the amplifier comes up here, and then it's designed where this would be where you would connect your wires. So what I'm going to do is fill these holes. The wiring for the amplifier will go from this. It'll be done underneath. I'll extend the bolts, and I'll have almost like a stud that goes through, and there'll be a ring terminal, and that'll attach the wires internally into the amplifier. So none of these wires will be visible. These holes will be filled. The only wiring you'll see are the power, or the positive and negative coming into the barrier strip, but I'll use the same barrier strips. So basically my whole point there is that all these holes go away and just the wiring comes in here. Notice kind of this piece, I'll explain this in a sec. The wiring is going to come up like that, right? And kind of sit up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm using cooling plate blocks that are for liquid cooling. And I've decided currently, we'll see if this changes, to use a 40 millimeter by 300 millimeter on each of the 4 amplifiers, the 2 Milberts and the 2 Zapcos. So the Milberts will be set up like this. Each block will be here. The way I'll set it up is the tubing, it's got an inlet and an outlet. I think it uses whatever, 5/8 inch or 1/2 inch or whatever, clear tubing. You're going to have an input and an output here, and then an input and output here, kind of where these lines are. Again, these holes go away. So the tubing will come in here, and there'll be a T connector for the tubing right here. Tubing comes in here and here, and then it'll drop down, and I'll have my dad drill a couple of more holes, and the tubing goes down inside of the zebra wood. So aesthetically, I think that'll be pretty cool. I just have to double check and make sure nothing is going to get in the way with the height of these plates relative to, for example, the speaker wire. So got to double check all that stuff, but that's kind of the thought on this, and then I'll show you the design and the Zapcos in just a moment. All right, in terms of cooling for the Zapcos, there are the boards out, if you're curious what those look like. I've had these kind of in and out working on a lot of the logistics. So here's what I'm thinking. The chassis, ironically, the chassis for the Milberts and the Zapcos are both exactly 18 inches long. So all 4 amps are the same length. I'm thinking about doing the cooling block or plate, whatever you want to call it, here in the center of the amp. So basically, real briefly, what's going to happen here is there's going to be a plate that hangs off the rear deck, much like there was before. I think it's going to be 1/8 inch aluminum. It'll cover the entire rear deck plate. These will be mounted, oriented like this. So basically, as they normally would be mounted, there'll be studs. I'll show you those in a little bit. I showed you those kayak bolts. Those studs, I'll probably do 2 at each end here. And then they'll come through the rear package shelf with some fender washers, and then that's what's going to hold the amplifiers in place. So in terms of the cooling plate, again, this is what I'm thinking. These are 40 millimeter, just over 1.5 inches by 300 millimeters long. If you noticed, there is a little tiny raised bump right here, and right here, which is not helpful. So I am going to have this entire surface machined so it's completely flat. I'm stripping the paint off as well. The fin area from here around and the bottoms will be painted. I'm not too worried about this because you won't see it where this is. I want this to be obviously bare metal to allow for the best possible heat transfer. So this will be a machined flat aluminum surface, and then this will be obviously aluminum as well for the cooling blocks, and then I'll use a thermal paste between the two. What I'm also going to do, kind of a cool idea, I think, is I had to figure out, okay, how am I going to mount these things? They are just under 1/2 inch thick, so this is like a little less than 1/4 to give you an idea of the thickness, right? And again, there's a little inlet and an outlet, and then water just goes through. It's just a water jacket. It's all it is, basically. So I need to figure out how to mount them, and I want it to be as clean as possible. So they're relatively cheap. I think they're about 15 or 20 bucks a piece. I'm going to buy, so I'll need 4 to do the job. I'll buy 5, and I'm going to take one to the guy locally that does machining. Joe from the Hood, if you were closer by, I would shoot the stuff over to you, but obviously I'm trying to get things done here. But I'll have the machinist butterfly one of these, so basically slice it down the middle. I'll open it up, and then I want to confirm my suspicions as it relates to where the tubing is and all of that. From there, I can see how much meat I have and where I have the meat. Then what I'll do is I'll drill, this will be the case on all 4 amplifiers. I'll drill through the amplifier, countersink underneath here, just probably 6/32 bolts or screws, and then I'll tap and thread the cooling block so long as I don't hit where the water is coming through. And that'll allow me to basically have it secured to all 4 amplifiers very, very securely. I'll do, probably 8 or 10 screws. And then also, more importantly the thermal transfer is what I'm all after here, right? It's just about getting the heat away from the amplifier. So the tighter those are, the more secure. With the thermal paste, the better. So that's currently my plan. We'll see how it goes. If I slice open one of those blocks and there's absolutely no room, then I've got to kind of punt and come up with a new plan. But again, that's what the last 30 hours over the last couple of weeks has been, just this brainstorming and coming up with ideas. Looking at this is kind of representative of, I just use this piece of plywood to kind of lay things out. More on this in a bit. This is going to be the gap between the amplifiers. So real quick, actually, let me show you these. Here's one sample. Shout out to James McDonald, who was nice enough to reply to my post on Old School Car Audio when I asked about, hey, does anybody know if Zapco made spacers for this series of amplifier? As far as I know, they did not. But James had a similar kind of a setup and similar idea to what I wanted to do. He took a Z600, one of these amps, and had it cut into 4 pieces. So there's the rest of the chunks, okay? What I'm going to do is, again, this is kind of a good side view. I'll bring this to my machinist, and I'll have him cut 4 pieces that are 2 inches, 3 pieces that are 2 inches wide. Also going to have him machine this face on all all pieces such that when I join them together, they're as tight as possible. I want this to be as unrecognizable as possible that they are joined together. When you look from the back deck kind of hanging down, it'll be one amplifier. You know, obviously you'll see these seams, but as close as I can get to being one amplifier, the overall length will be 42 inches. So it's going to look pretty cool. My thought with the Zapcos is I want them, obviously I need to show them and all of that, but I want them to be kind of hidden away and inconspicuous. I think the highlight's going to be obviously on the Millbirds, right? No disrespect to Zapcos or Zapco fans out there, but all right, so that's going to be the cooling. And then here again, you're going to have an input and an output here. I'll bring those together. I'll run a T connector, and then I'll have that. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go from here. This again is going to be hanging off the rear package shelf. I will also more than likely make it so that there will be a large cover in the rear package shelf, kind of like grill cloth or whatever, that I can remove, and you'll see these. I think that'll look pretty cool, and more ideas to come on that. So that, I just wanted to review the concept there. Beyond the plates in terms of the cooling, there are radiators which have fans attached to them, and there's a pump. My biggest thing right now I'm still brainstorming on is where to put the radiators, because I'm likely going to do at a minimum 4 120 millimeter pumps, or excuse me, fans. So 4 fans, which is that's going to be huge. I've got to come up with a home for that, and I'm brainstorming some ideas there. Anybody has anything, feel free to enter into the comments below. I'm looking for something crazy creative and very effective. So, all right, let's continue on, and we'll go to the next step. All right, a couple of other details I want to show. This is the old piece of aluminum that was hanging from the rear deck. It was actually a really good idea. And it's 1/8 inch aluminum. And this is kind of what held up a lot of the stuff. The way that I'm going to be doing it is I'm going to go directly through this into the rear deck for just about everything. So I'm not going to rely on this itself to hold. You know, I'm going to kind of make a sandwich of the two metals. So I wanted to show this. This is just, again, the old piece that I'm using for a mock-up. I've got a new sheet of aluminum that I'll cut because I'm going to go a little bit wider as well. But I just wanted to show that. I also wanted to show this. This is, again, mocked up. That's basically what the Zapcos and Sony components will look like. So their basic placement. So as you can see, I've got the gap between the two Zapcos. There'll be a spacer there. There'll be a link here and here, 2-inch link. So again, we got a nice big giant Zapco. The way that Earl did it is the P1 and X1, these legs he cut off. I'm going to do the same thing and then mount those together. This is, again, just sitting in there now. There is enough room, just enough, to be able to open the doors for the C1s. And in a moment, you'll see how I'm going to do the bottoms and of the Zapcos. I'm going to make new bottoms, and then the changers will mount to the bottoms, as will the P1 and X1. And then the bottoms, I'm going to make some new brackets inside of the amplifiers, and then the bottoms will have hardware that goes through the bottoms of the amplifiers into the brackets that I'll build. So I'll show kind of the plan there in just a moment. One other quick thing regarding cooling, this is the power inverter. This unit here, the Power Max, I've shown that before. I'm going to be spending a lot of time listening to the car kind of sitting in the garage, so this thing's going to be running a lot. Comes with a really cheap junky fan, this black one here. This is, I don't know how you pronounce this, Noctua. It's the best quality fan I could find, really nice ball bearings, and it's designed to be very, very quiet. Much better quality than what this is. So again, I'm not going to liquid cool this, although I could, but who knows, maybe I will. But for now, I'm going to plan on just upgrading the fan. All right, I am going to go ahead and close out this particular video. I just want to show there were 3 humps in the rear deck. These were humps with reinforcement, like threaded inserts for, I believe they were for car seat mounts. which I don't plan on using. And also, you're going to see some things in the rear deck. I want to try to get away from explaining everything I'm going to do and show, more actual footage of what I'm doing. I did have to do a little bit of dirty cutting there. You'll see why as well, as far as the plate going against the rear seat. The one thing I do want to show, I did get a new piece of 1/8 inch aluminum. Stuff is not cheap. It's about $125. And that will be the new rack that hangs from the rear deck. One little sneak peek I do want to show. I mentioned a little bit ago about some cooling I'm going to be working on. I'm going to be building some kind of a DIY loop, rather complex, I guess, once again, over-engineered. But I'm playing around with the notion of these blocks, one for each amplifier, one for each Milbert, and for the Zapcos. And then for anybody who's ever played with these are a thermoelectric cooler. Very cool device. I haven't really played with it yet, but the whole concept is very interesting. And I might be, if that goes to plan, I'll be doing something pretty cool for the cooling. But that, again, will wrap up this video. I certainly appreciate the watching. And go ahead and like and subscribe if you are so inclined. And the next couple of videos will be really cool. There's some really good stuff coming. Some modifications, heavy modifications to the chassis of the Zapcos, and you'll be seeing that shortly. But thanks again, and talk to you soon.